ทดสอบทดสอบทดสอบทดสอบทดสอบทดสอบครับเรียนท่านวิทยากรนะครับคณะผู้จัดงานนะครับคณาจารย์นักวิชาการและก็ผู้สนใจผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านเลยนะครับที่ได้ให้เกียรติกับทางโครงการนะครับในการเข้าร่วมการประชุมวิชาการประจำปีของเครือข่ายปรัชญาสังคมศาสตร์ไทยครั้งที่2นะครับในวันที่ 26 และ 27 กรกฎาคมนี้นะครับซึ่งในเมื่อวานนะครับเราก็ได้ทั้งฟังการบรรยายนะครับจาก keynote speaker ของเรานะครับท่านดร. โปรเฟสเซอร์แดเนียล ลิตเทิลนะครับท่านได้ให้เกียรติบรรยายในหัวข้อเมื่อวานไป1ครั้งแล้วนะครับและวันนี้ท่านยังอยู่กับเรานะครับยังอยู่กับเราเพื่อที่จะให้ความรู้เรานะครับในอีกช่วงหนึ่งนะครับในเซสชั่นเช้าก่อนที่หลังจากการให้การบรรยายแล้วนะครับก็จะเป็นการนำเสนอในบทความต่างๆอีก3บทความด้วยกันในวันนี้นะครับฉะนั้นขออนุญาตนำเรียนถึงกำหนดการในช่วงเช้านะครับหลังจากนี้เนี่ยเราจะเริ่มรับฟัง Special Lecture นะครับจาก Professor Daniel Little นะครับในหัวข้อ Organizational Causes of Large Technology Failures นะครับแล้วก็จะได้รับเกียรตินะครับการสรุปความเป็นภาษาไทยนะครับโดยดร.ภักจิรานักบรรเลงนะครับจากคณะบริหารธุรกิจเศรษฐศาสตร์และการสื่อสารมหาวิทยาลัยนเรศวรนะครับซึ่งในหัวข้อได้ครับต้องขอความรู้นะครับท่านอาจารย์วัชรพลและอาจารย์ยาเลศนะครับได้ให้ความรู้นะครับด้วยการสรุปความเป็นภาษาไทยนะครับในหัวข้อช่วงเช้านะครับและก็ในหัวข้อนี้ครับจะมีการ Special Lecture อยู่ประมาณ1ชั่วโมงนะครับและหลังจากนั้นเนี่ยเราก็จะรันต่อเลยนะครับการนำเสนอบทความอีก3บทความนะฮะคาดว่าก็น่าจะเสร็จเราช่วงเดียวกับเมื่อวานนะฮะอาจจะเสร็จประมาณใกล้ๆบ่ายแล้วก็ทานอาหารกันแต่ว่ากำหนดการทั้งหมดก็จะเสร็จสิ้นในช่วงเช้าเลยนะครับฉะนั้นในโอกาสแรกนี้นะครับจะขอเรียนเชิญนะครับ Professor Daniel Little นะครับได้ให้เกียรติ Special Lecture ในหัวข้อ Organization Causes of Large Technology Failures ขอเรียนเชิญครับ May I invite Professor Daniel Little to give us a special lecture on topic Organizational Causes of Large Technology Failures, please.
It's not showing here, though. Okay. So good morning. Good morning. Thank you for being here today, because it's a little bit off script relative to philosophy of social science, but it's not irrelevant. But I am a volunteer. I volunteered to give a workshop on this topic, organizational causes of large technology failure. And I volunteered because I think it is a terribly important topic. We have technology failures all over the place in the modern world, in the United States, in Russia, in China, in India, and I'm sure in Thailand as well. We have failures in gas plants, in aircraft, in air traffic control, in nuclear power plants. We have disasters almost everywhere we look. They're not frequent, but they occur, they hurt people. Sometimes they hurt lots of people, like the Fukushima nuclear meltdown following tsunami. And so the question is, what kinds of causes give rise to large technology failure? If I had asked you that question to start, I think some of you might have said technology failures are caused by bad design. That's one possibility. Or technology failures are caused by operator error. The pilot made a mistake. The plant manager made a mistake. Both of those theories are completely insufficient, in my opinion, in almost all accidents. And it isn't really just my opinion, but it is the opinion of safety experts who expand the view of the nature of technology, complex technologies, and then the ways in which they fail. And to expand the view means not just looking for the proximate cause, the immediately preceding cause of an air crash, let's say, but the larger system failure which led to the possibility of that air crash. And so the topic for me today, I would say this evening, but it's morning, my topic this morning, in fact, maybe being closer is a good idea. My topic is on the topic of organizational failure. Failures of the organizations which design, manage, and implement complex technologies. And it turns out that there are really interesting contributions in the social sciences to this question, but you have to be kind of a synthesizer in order to see how a theory and a conception of failure comes out of these different theories. So what I would like to do today is just to overview 4 different approaches to the question of organizational failure. Maybe one example of an organizational failure might be relevant. The tsunami disaster, the Fukushima nuclear disaster now 10, 15 years ago, was the result of a completely natural event, an earthquake which caused a massive tsunami, which flooded a complex of nuclear power generators in Fukushima, which led to a catastrophic failure of 2 or 3 nuclear cores with a release of some radiation and the possibility of release of a massive amount of radiation. So a very serious disaster, but you might say, oh, it was a natural disaster that led to a nuclear disaster. But actually, looking at that case in detail, we see that it was also a failure of regulatory process, of design process, and of business process. The business process part has to do with ordinary business reasoning about profit and loss, costs, and how to economize in a complicated business process, which is generating electricity using nuclear power. The regulatory process is the process in Japan which was used to ensure reactor safety, ensure the safety of the public, and to design reactors which would not kill people. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States is that agency, and there's a comparable agency in Fukushima, or in Japan. So that's the regulatory process. And then there's the design question. The design question, it turns out, was badly flawed for the placement of those reactors, badly flawed because nuclear reactors are usually built near water supplies. The Fukushima complex was built near the Pacific Ocean as a source of a heat sink, basically, and assumptions had to be made about possible future wave surges and ocean level surges. Assumptions needed to be made. The assumption that was made was an average worst case scenario assumption. The assumption was that the largest tsunami that should be considered is a 40-foot surge. This was estimated to happen once in 100 years, which is longer than the lifespan of this reactor complex. So the assumption was a 40-foot surge. As it happened, the tsunami created by the earthquake was a 53-foot surge. So water immediately overwhelmed the protection of the plant from being disastrously and catastrophically flooded. On top of that, nuclear power plants are protected by auxiliary diesel generators, but the design process put those generators below ground level. They were in the sub-basement levels of the reactors because of expense. Locating them further away on higher ground was considered an unnecessary expense. So the upshot was a bad decision about which bad scenario outcome to consider, a once in 100 years scenario, a 40-foot surge, or an almost impossible surge of 55 feet. And so the 40-foot surge was chosen. And then the choice of where to put the auxiliary generators was based on cost reduction, basically. Be efficient in the design of this complex of reactors. Both those decisions led to a catastrophic failure because the coolant was, the cooling system for the nuclear core was immediately extinguished by flooding, and the diesel generators could not be activated because they had been flooded. That would be an example of an organizational failure, or really multiple organizational failures leading to a massive catastrophe. Now, the big question is, how can we diagnose, how can we identify, can we develop a language for describing these social, institutional, and organizational causes of dysfunction that can lead to technology disaster? What I have found really interesting is that there are 4 different kinds of theories which have contributed to this question. The first that I'll talk about very briefly is Charles Perrow, a sociologist previously at Yale, now retired, who wrote a book called Normal Accidents. The second is a book by another sociologist, Diane Vaughan, who considered the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. I'm sorry to say most of you are too young to remember the day in 1986 when the Space Shuttle blew up and killed all the astronauts on board. It was very traumatic. And the question was, why did that happen? NASA, National, whatever it is, the American Space Agency, was thought to be a highly effective, highly efficient organization which could handle manned spaceflight, and yet it had a catastrophic failure on the morning of the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Diane Vaughan wrote a sociological analysis of the decision-making which happened at NASA in the 6 months preceding the launch and then the day of the launch, and she came to some very interesting conclusions that we'll talk about. The third possibility is a more optimistic possibility. It's called high reliability organization theory, and it is the idea that some organizations seem more resilient to failure than other organizations. And so sociologists, business analysts, and organizational theory specialists have considered some organizations like aircraft carrier management, highly complex operations which could lead to disastrous crashes on a deck if an aircraft is left not properly stowed. Lots and lots of risk, and yet the number of crashes, the number of accidents on military aircraft carriers is extremely low. And so we might ask, how does that happen? What are the characteristics of aircraft carrier management which allow them to be less vulnerable to failure than, let's say, power plants? So this is the theory of high reliability organizations. Then the final theory I'd like to refer to is by a personal favorite of mine, an engineering professor, Nancy Levison, who has written extensively on system safety in all kinds of systems, from radiation machines for cancer treatments, radiation therapy machines, to Mars landing space vehicles. All of those technologies have had serious failures, and she offers an engineer's conception of what some of the weak points were in the design process and the management process. So these 4 theories, I think, are complementary and very helpful. Normal accident theory, what is called normalization of deviance, that's Diane Vaughan's theory. High reliability organization theory, which tries to say we can overcome these tendencies towards large catastrophic failures in dangerous technologies, and then the idea of system safety, designing for safety. We'll look at all of those. I have found, in teaching a course in the School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, I have found the use of case studies, looking at very careful analysis of major failures in industry, sometimes nuclear failures, sometimes aircraft failures. The most interesting, well, lots and lots of interesting failures that when we go through the details of the case, we can see failures of organization, management failures, supervision failures, training failures. We can diagnose an awful lot of the organizational dysfunctions which lead to technology failure. the kind of accidents that I'm interested in studying, the Challenger and the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster, it's interesting that 2 space shuttles had catastrophic failure. You might think that one was enough and that the problems of oversight and engineering, which occurred in the first disaster in 1986, would not be repeated, but actually the 1995 failure of the Columbia space vehicle kind of showed the same sorts of problems at NASA. Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, those nuclear disasters all deserve very careful analysis, understanding how in a capitalist environment and in a communist environment, the Chernobyl disaster did not happen under capitalist conditions, but under the management of the Communist Party, how such a horrible catastrophe could occur. Careful case study is interesting there as well. Chemical plants and gas plants are kind of routine accidents, but they're routine accidents which lead to massive harm. Sometimes it's massive harm to the surrounding area if it's a release of a toxic gas like at Bhopal in India, the release which caused thousands of deaths and serious debilitating lifetime injuries. So the Bhopal chemical plant disaster is worth very careful study. But other disasters which kill maybe 20 or 30 workers in a plant and require evacuation of all residents within a mile of the plant, that would be another kind of example. These are not of the same magnitude as a nuclear power plant disaster, but they are terrible outcomes which need to be avoided, and we can get a lot of details about what went wrong in these instances. The explosion in the Beirut port and the Tianjin port in China, those 2 port explosions I think are very interesting. I'll mention a case which I think is of interest in every country, and that is the question of failures of hospital and patient safety. Systemic causes of serious injury and death occurring in health systems for a variety of reasons. And once again, we would like to understand what those reasons are. And often those reasons have to do with management and organizational decisions that have been made internal to a hospital and a health system. I've also applied this kind of reasoning to the occurrence of sexual misconduct scandals in universities and also military accidents, friendly fire accidents, for example. How do they occur? Prominent sources of failure, the kinds of issues which can arise in large technology system, regulatory failure. We expect regulatory agencies to protect the public, to protect the health and safety of the workers and the public. And agencies often fail for reasons that we really need to work very hard to understand. Failure is, of course, making errors is a part of the human condition. To err is human, to err is human. But we would like to have our organizations not make mistakes as often as they actually do. Regulatory failure is preventable. It is possible to design regulatory regime which is more effective than, for example, the Nuclear Regulatory Agency in the United States. Management failures, including especially cost-cutting priorities within an organization. Management failures lead to unsafe outcomes and lead to major accidents. The example which I've studied in detail is a gas plant, an Esso gas plant in Longford, Australia, which had an explosion which had to be traced backwards. But one of the critical elements is the fact that Exxon and Esso, as a cost-cutting move, removed the engineering team from the plant and moved them to the headquarters, corporate headquarters in, I think, Sydney. And their reasoning was it's very expensive to maintain an engineering team in each of their 5 plants around Australia. We can centralize that, reduce a lot of costs, and with new modern technology, we can communicate to every plant very easily. Well, it turned out that the sharing of knowledge and information from the engineers to the operators was much less effective when the engineers were not actually in the plant. So that was a management error that was caused by cost cutting, by a corporate desire to streamline costs and streamline staff. Other kinds of failures which can occur, internal conflicts within an organization where one part of the organization is pursuing one goal and another part of the organization has a contradictory goal. That kind of conflict of priorities within an organization can lead to disaster. And poor communication throughout an organization, where one part of the organization has good information. In fact, that is a part of the story of the release of lots and lots of raw crude oil in the Caribbean, or in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Deepwater Horizon disaster. The contracting company had information which the contractor did not have, and the result of that was also disaster. And then more routine things, poor training, poor oversight, poor compliance, and design failures. These all can contribute to major disasters. And we might say, well, training is training, but what we expect of a nuclear plant or of a gas plant, a dangerous process plant, we expect training to be both well-designed and also effectively implemented. So normal accidents. This is Charles Perrow, and his, I'll just read one quote from his book, because this is a very important book, and it really can be summarized fairly quickly, but he goes into a lot of cases in detail. Quoting from that book on the very first page, I will dwell upon characteristics of high-risk technologies that suggest that no matter how effective conventional safety devices are, there is a form of accident that is inevitable. It's a very scary sentence. This is not good news for systems that have high catastrophic potential, such as nuclear power plants, nuclear weapon systems, recombinant DNA production, or even ships carrying highly toxic or explosive cargoes. It suggests, for example, the probability of a nuclear plant meltdown with dispersion of radioactive materials is not one chance in a million, but more like one chance in the next decade. His recalculation of the risk of a catastrophic nuclear accident like Chernobyl in the United States or in China is vastly higher risk than what nuclear engineers have estimated. So what is normal accident? His basic view is modern technology systems are complex socio-technology systems. It's not just the technology, it is also the management of the people, the experts, the supervisors, and the frontline workers who jointly bring about the smooth functioning of the plant or possibly the catastrophic failure of the plant. So risky, complex enterprises are social organizations, and social organizations have dysfunctions that we can identify. They also involve multiple processes. It's very interesting to take a look at a diagram of the flow of material and energy within a gas processing plant, because you can see the multiple ways in which processes interact with each other, with feedback possible, leading to the proliferation of accident from one part of the system to another part of the system in ways that are kind of unpredictable. Loose and tight coupling is another of his ideas. If a pump fails, and the consequence of the pump failing in a nuclear power plant is that 3 seconds later, the core overheats and releases an explosive volume of hydrogen gas. If 3 seconds is the amount of time that you have, then that's called tight coupling, the event failure leading to an even more massive and destructive failure of cooling and therefore release of energy, release of hydrogen gas, and an explosion. That was what happened at Chernobyl. So loose and tight coupling. If a mistake is made in a tenure process at this university, it's not a tightly coupled system. No horrible disaster will occur at the university. If a mistake is made, a failure is made in the cooling system of a nuclear power plant, the team has literally seconds to respond, and often the response, it's not clear what the correct response is. It is possible to have multiple simultaneous failures, which you might think is, well, how likely is that? If one item is has a 1 in 1,000 rate of failure and another 1 in 100 rate of failure, then surely it's highly unlikely they would fail simultaneously. And yet, in case after case, we find surprising conjunctions of failures, which are unrelated, but they lead to a very unpredictable situation which quickly proliferates. So his gloomy conclusion is that it is the complexity of the system, not operator failure, not design failure necessarily, though he does identify design failures. Instead, it is the complexity of the system itself which leads to the occurrence of what he calls normal accidents. So I'm moving on to normalization of deviance. And what that concept is, Diane Vaughan is, she's really a smart kind of industrial sociologist. She observes processes and then tries to understand why they fail in the way that they do. Her book on Challenger, the Challenger disaster, I think it's called the Challenger launch decision, is a micro-sociological study of the step-by-step process which led to the decision to launch the space shuttle on that early morning. You might recall that the space shuttle was scheduled to launch in January in Florida. Florida, if you have any concept of the United States, it's one of the hottest states in the country. So very little provisional planning was made for cold weather in Florida, but Florida was having a cold wave, and oranges were falling off the trees. It was that cold. The temperature predicted for the launch day was, I think, 36 degrees. And so the question had to be evaluated very quickly. Is it safe to launch at 36 degrees? A shuttle had never been launched at below, I think, 55 degrees ambient temperature. And so a quick process of evaluation was undertaken. There was a great deal of political pressure and organizational pressure to go ahead with the launch. And the launch schedule had already been badly disrupted by other events. There had been a commitment, a political commitment, to launch at least 12 shuttles per year, and the NASA was falling badly behind in that schedule. So there was lots of organizational and political pressure to go ahead with the launch. There was an engineering conference at the, let's see, yeah, here we go. Engineering conference with Morton Thiokol, which was the manufacturer of the rocket engines. Their engineering staff was convened by a special meeting, and they had empirical data, and they came to a very clear recommendation. The O-rings, the rings which seal the two parts of the rocket during ignition, when there's very high pressure, very high temperature, the O-rings lose resilience as temperature drops. And their graphs were very convincing. By the time you get to 40 degrees, the resilience of the O-ring was roughly the resilience of this piece of glass. It was rigid and breakable. And so their recommendation, the engineering recommendation, was not to launch below, I think, 53 degrees. If the outdoor temperature in Florida is below 53 degrees, then do not launch. The central NASA administrator responsible for the launch was incredulous. His view was, we've delayed the launch, now you egg-headed engineers have the idea that we should have a new standard, 53 degrees. What are you talking about? Do you want to ruin the agency? He was lividly angry. The engineers stood their ground, but their boss, the vice president for manufacturing, I think, said, we're going to go offline for a minute. They went offline. When they came back, the engineers were all silent, and the vice president said, we now approve the launch. So the pressure from NASA led to a reversal of the engineering recommendation that the launch not proceed. The result was catastrophic. The launch did go ahead. The O-rings were, in fact, rigid, and when the hot gas hit the O-ring, it just immediately vented out and melted, burned parts of the rocket, and the rocket exploded. What does this show? She came to a novel idea, and that is, it's the idea of normalization of deviance. That sounds a little perplexing, that phrase, but what she means is deviance from administrative procedure, normalization of deviance from existing bureaucratic procedure. The procedures concerning the O-rings, the procedure was initially that any damage to the O-ring perceived in one launch should affect the decision about the next launch. But in fact, there had been O-ring damage for a couple of years, and it was getting worse, but there was never a disaster. And so the engineering teams themselves for NASA came to believe it's not as bad as we thought. The O-rings are holding, they're showing burn through in various places, but everything's okay because our launches have gone okay. That's what she calls normalization of deviance. And it was a catastrophic outcome because on that January morning, the amount of damage which occurred to the O-ring was sufficient to allow a complete burn through and a complete destruction of the rocket. So normalization of deviance, she thinks, is a systemic issue in any organization. She uses the word ethnocognition, group cognition, a kind of an attitude towards risk which involves getting acclimated to a new level of risk until finally you're taking risks that are completely insane. But you don't notice it because the previous week was almost as bad and nothing bad happened. Okay, so that's normalization of deviance. How about high reliability organization? We'd like to think we can design processes, we can design training programs, we can design administrative procedures which prevent the likelihood of these kinds of failures. And empirical studies have been done of organizations which do in fact have very good safety records. Organizational sociologists have come up with lists of characteristics which good safety organizations can embody. The question is, can we get to a sufficiently low level of risk in something like the operation of a nuclear power plant, where the possibility is the death by radiation poisoning of several thousand people? Can we improve operational procedures to the point where the risk of a release of radiation is approaching zero? And let's first take a look at what the recommendations were. It is there are a handful of recommendations. First of all, that leadership in the organization should be focused on safety. Safety should be the number one objective. If you think about most corporations, safety is not the number one objective. Maintaining stock value, maintaining profitability, cost effectiveness, these are leading business priorities. Safety has a place in the system of thinking, but it is not the number one priority. And yet, that turns out to be a very serious hazard. Secondly, there should be leadership clarity about what the goals of the operation, what the goals of the organization are. A third recommendation is that redundancy is helpful. If there's a system for controlling nuclear core temperature, and then engineers should be thinking about a backup system also, or a redundancy system, so that failure of one system doesn't lead to catastrophic failure. In the case of the O-rings, for example, you might have imagined a design which had two levels of O-ring, two levels of sealing ring, so that the failure of the first ring would not necessarily lead to the failure of the second ring. I don't know if that's technologically feasible, but that's what redundancy would require. And business managers often don't like redundancy because redundancy means extra cost. You have a second system to maintain, design, implement. Much simpler is to have one system which can be integrated and then costs can be contained. A culture of safety first needs to be cultivated throughout the organization. If you were to interview frontline workers, supervisors, managers, vice presidents, and executives, you would like to be assured, all of them say, our first priority is safety, worker safety and safety of the public, and we're always aware of that possibility. The high reliability organization theorists have found there's an interesting confusion by top-level executives of companies because they tend to think of safety as accidents on the job, but that's not the serious risk which many industries face. The serious risk is a system failure leading to a massive explosion, a massive release of toxic gas, a system accident rather than a slip and fall accident. But the focus of safety planning within many organizations, including ESSO and its drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico, their emphasis was on slip and fall accidents, not having an environment where workers will have an individual harm resulting in a loss of work days. That's not the primary concern. Continuity of training, continuity of staff over a period of time. I was once told at the University of Michigan Health System, there's a worst day of the year to get sick. It's July 1st. And that's because July 1st is the day when new residents and fellows show up for their very first day of work. So you want a person who's not the first day on the job. But likewise, in a nuclear power plant, you want experienced managers and experienced operating process directors. Their overlap of knowledge needs to be secured and continuous over time. Pay attention to near misses. This is really great advice. A near miss is an accident which almost occurred. There was an aircraft near miss just a few days ago in which an aircraft approaching a runway was only 200 feet above ocean level. It had basically descended prematurely, and the pilot was unaware of it. Well, that's a near miss, and we would like to know how could that have happened? What happened in the cockpit? What happened in the air traffic control system? Okay, system safety, a really important topic. I'm not going to dwell on it because time is short, but Nancy Levison has looked very carefully at the question of system safety, how to design systems for safe operations. And she has a number of, I think, very good recommendations, but maybe the best recommendation is one that is familiar to all of us. In the software industry, software is often buggy, has bugs. So we get an app and it doesn't work quite right, and we file our error report and then it gets fixed. That's called design, fly, test, redesign. So it's rather than designing for a fully professionally designed satisfactory functioning, there's a kind of an adjustment process over time. In software, for entertainment purposes, maybe that works fine. It doesn't work fine for either software design or hardware design in critical kinds of operations. Her recommendation, in other words, is that we need to have rigorous standards of engineering design process which are organized around safety. And that means testing and evaluating as fully as possible before implementing the technology. Case studies, I think, are very important, and we can certainly identify errors and kind of deficiencies in software. The one which I find the most visually kind of interesting, she analyzes the case of an X-ray radiation medical device, I think it was called Therac 25, which was for directing X-ray radiation to a tumor. And the settings would be set in a control room right outside the clinical room. For 1 year, this device correctly treated cancers, and then it began killing people. That's a nightmare. You go to the hospital, you take your radiation therapy, and then you die. And the question was, what was happening? What was happening, it turned out, was that the data entry process had a design which allowed the operator to outrun the buffer, to enter enough characters that the state of the system reset. And so instead of entering the prescription correctly, the data entry system went back to the initial settings of the device, which was maximum. So instead of getting the moderated prescription that was prescribed for this patient, the patient was getting the full maximum radiation dosage possible, and of course, that was very harmful to them. What's interesting about the case is that it had nothing to do with the radiation device itself. It had to do with the software supporting the entry of the control functions, and she pays a huge amount of attention to control functions. So if you were doing software science, you'd want to read Nancy Leveson very carefully. She is especially critical of these points: unnecessary complexity, too much software functionality, adding too many bells and whistles to a program she thinks is a prescription for failure. Inadequate review and testing of both devices and also of software, and also inadequate identification of critical elements throughout the mission. Okay, I'm at the end. There's a pretty dramatic picture of a major failure. This case is fascinating to read because it's like a crime novel of corporate failure, Exxon's failure to properly plan and oversee its drilling mission, but also these kind of more technical failures of interface of information and regulation occurring at many levels. It makes the Deepwater Horizon case a really interesting one to study. And the other case, which I think is really fascinating, is to study hospital safety. All of us go to hospitals, all of us are exposed to treatment and diagnosis and prescription. A safety expert that I'm acquainted with gave a lecture on hospital safety, and he mentioned a study which said that in American hospitals, inpatient administration of prescription drugs are wrong 50% of the time. 50% of the time. Most of those errors are inconsequential, like 2 aspirins rather than 1, but some of them are deadly. And I could name for you incidents of overdosing of patients, which leads to death. This doesn't mean that the hospital system is inherently unsafe. It does mean that hospital administrators would be well advised to read this literature of system safety very, very carefully. Okay, that's a fast overview. What I really wanted to share with you is that this is sociologically important, but it's also important in terms of the lives that we live in complex societies in Thailand, in the United States, and in Russia, in China. It doesn't matter what the political system is. These complex technology systems are subject to very similar kinds of failure. And if we don't understand them well enough, then we're vulnerable to repeating the same accidents. One final point I'll make is that in the course I taught, I always had 3 or 4 serving military officers in my class of 30 students, master's students, and those students would often say, yes, I see that failure in my work in the military also. So the military also is subject to these kinds of organizational failures. Okay, thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Daniel, for such a wonderful lecture. Well, วันนี้ผมขออนุญาตทำหน้าที่สรุปความแทนวิทยากรหลักตามกำหนดการนะครับผมควรหันหน้าไปทางไหนครับมีคำถามรอคิวแล้วด้วย The question is in the queue already. So ตรงไหนดีครับตรงนี้ก็ได้ใช้คอมนะครับก็จะขออนุญาตเป็นผมแล้วก็อาจารย์ยาเรศจะช่วยเสริมนะครับก่อนที่จะนำไปสู่ช่วงคำถาม Q&A นะฮะทางท่านอาจารย์แดเนียลนะครับได้จริงท่านตั้งใจว่าแต่แรกเลยเนี่ยจะเป็นลักษณะเวิร์กช็อปนะครับคือมีเวลากับมันค่อนข้างมากคือครึ่งวันหรือเป็นเต็มวันก็ได้ในหัวข้อนี้นะครับจากสไลด์แต่แรกของท่านเนี่ยเกือบ100 สไลด์นะครับขอเรียนให้ทุกท่านทราบว่าเกือบ100 สไลด์เลยทีเดียวแต่ว่าด้วยปรับกันไปตามสถานการณ์นะครับเราก็เลยมาเป็นในลักษณะของการเป็นแบบกึ่งทอล์กหรือ brief lecture ประมาณนั้นนะครับถ้าอาจารย์พูดในหัวข้อเรื่อง organizational causes นะครับหรือว่าผมไม่แน่ใจในเชิงการใช้คำแปลนะครับเดี๋ยวอาจจะท่านใดเสริมให้อีกทีคือในเรื่องของสาเหตุหรือมูลเหตุในเชิงของในระดับขององค์กรหรือการจัดการหรือในระดับที่มันเป็นโครงสร้างนั่นเองนะครับที่มันได้นำไปสู่การที่เทคโนโลยีขนาดใหญ่ นะครับเรื่องราวใหญ่ๆโตๆเนี่ยแล้วมันเกิดเฟลเลียคือความล้มเหลวเกิดเป็นอุบิเหตุเกิดเป็นอุบัติเหตุอุบัติภัยที่มันยิ่งใหญ่นะครับargument หลักๆของท่านอาจารย์ลิตเติ้ลเนี่ยบอกว่าเราจะไปโทษว่าเป็น human error อย่างเดียวไม่ถูกนะครับมันอาจใช่แต่ว่ามันอาจจะมีสาเหตุหรือ causes อื่นๆอีกเยอะเลยนะแล้วก็ในส่วนที่เป็นระดับที่โดยทั่วไปแล้วเรามักจะถูกมองข้ามไปนะครับก็คือ organizational causes คือเฮ้ยจริงๆมันเป็นความผิดพลาดในระดับใหญ่กว่าที่จะเป็นแค่ human error นะครับท่านก็มี argument หลักๆอยู่ประมาณนี้นะครับทีนี้ในส่วนของการบรรยายเนี่ยอาจารย์แดเนียลเนี่ยพูดถึงทฤษฎีหลักๆเอาไว้นะครับอยู่ 4-5 ตัวด้วยกันนะครับก่อนที่ท่านจะพูดถึงcase study ในช่วงท้ายนะครับทฤษฎีแรกคือต้องออกตัวว่าเราพูดกันในมุมของความเป็นนักรัฐศาสตร์เนาะแต่ว่าเรื่องราวที่ท่านพูดเนี่ยจริงๆเดี๋ยวอาจจะมีเมื่อกี้เพื่อนผมเป็นสาย disaster เนาะอาจารย์วัชรพลสุภจักรวัฒนาอาจจะช่วยเสริมทีหลังนะนี่จะโดยตรงกว่านะครับอาจารย์แดเนียลพูดถึงtheory ที่โดดเด่นอยู่ในสายนี้นะครับคือตัวแรกคือ normal accident theory ของ Perrow นะครับคือตามชื่อเลยฮะคือ normal accident น่ะต่อให้เราพยายามระมัดระวังแค่ไหนแต่เทคโนโลยีที่มีความเสี่ยงสูงอย่างเช่นเรื่องของเคมีคอลเรื่องของการปล่อยจรวดขึ้นไปในอวกาศเนี่ยมันคือทฤษฎีนี้ก็จะบอกว่าคือลึกๆแล้วเราเชื่อว่ามันมีโอกาสที่จะเกิดความล้มเหลวหรือมีอุบัติเหตุเกิดขึ้นได้ต่อให้เราพยายามระมัดระวังก็ตามนะครับในส่วนของการไปทฤษฎีแรกเนี่ยก็บอกว่ามันก็สัมพันธ์กันโดยทั่วไปนะฮะอย่างเช่นยิ่งถ้าเราไปเร่งกระบวนการมันนะเป็น process ที่มันยิ่งเร็วยิ่งขึ้นมีความเชื่อมโยงกับอะไรหลายอย่างที่มันซับซ้อนยิ่งขึ้นสุดท้ายaccident ก็ยิ่งมีโอกาสมากขึ้นตามไปด้วยนะครับแล้วก็โดยส่วนใหญ่ก็มักจะเกิดจากเหตุการณ์ที่ unexpected ก็คือไม่ได้คาดคิดด้วยซ้ำนะฮะอันนี้ทฤษฎีแรกเขาก็จะบอกประมาณนี้มันก็ normal แหละนะครับจะมี accident ก็พอเข้าใจได้นะครับทฤษฎีที่2ที่ท่านพูดก็คือพูดถึง normalization of deviance นะครับของ Vauxhall ไม่แน่ใจว่าอ่านถูกหรือเปล่านะครับก็เชื่อมโยงกับเคสของ NASA ในการลอนช์จรวดขึ้นไปเนี่ยนะครับอันเนี้ยมันก็จะมีข้อถกเถียงเรื่องความเคยชินหรืออะไรต่างๆ normalization คือหลายๆอย่างมันถูกทำให้เป็นเรื่องธรรมดาไปนะครับเราก็เลยอาจจะเพิกเฉยหรือว่าละเลยในเรื่องความปลอดภัยเป็นต้นอันเนี้ยในเคสลึกๆอาจารย์ท่านก็พูดถึงโอริงใช่ไหมครับเรื่องของการที่แบบระหว่างฝ่ายวิศวกรรมกับฝ่ายตัดสินใจถกเถียงกันว่ามันจะปล่อยได้หรือยังอะไรเงี้ยนะฮะต้องอุณหภูมิที่53องศาฟาเรนไฮต์นะอะไรต่างๆนะครับนี่ทฤษฎีแนวทางที่2คือโอเคอาจารย์ยาเล่เสริมตรงนี้เชิญครับ
ค่ะก็อาจารย์ก็บอกว่าเหมือนกับประมาณว่าวิศวกรจริงๆก็กังวลก็คือวิศวกรรู้อยู่แล้วแหละว่าอันเนี้ยมันไม่ได้มาตรฐานอะไรอย่างเงี้ยค่ะแต่ว่ามันดีเวียนไปก็คือเหมือนกับมันก็ปล่อยให้เกิดขึ้นอะไรอย่างเงี้ยเพราะฉะนั้นน่ะปัญหาของอันเนี้ยค่ะมันก็เป็นปัญหาของตัวการที่แบบเป็นปัญหาของตัวองค์กรเนาะแล้วก็เป็นองค์กรที่เกี่ยวข้องกับการที่แบบวิศวกรเนี่ยแม้ว่าจะรู้ผลอยู่แล้วอะค่ะว่ารู้อยู่แล้วว่าอันเนี้ยมันไม่ได้มาตรฐานอะไรเงี้ยแต่ก็ยังคงปล่อยให้เกิดขึ้น
ขอบคุณครับก็สองตัวนะครับคือ normal accident ตัวแรกตัวที่2คือ normalization of deviance นะครับแล้วก็ตัวที่3คืออาจารย์แดเนียลพูดถึง HRO นะครับ HRO คือ High Reliability Organization คืออันนี้ก็ต้องบอกว่าค่อนข้างพยายามแล้วใช่ไหมครับทำให้มันมีลักษณะของความน่าเชื่อถือให้สูงที่สุดเพื่อที่จะควบคุมความล้มเหลวให้มันไม่เกิดขึ้นนะครับอาจารย์ก็พูดถึงจริงๆอันนี้โดยส่วนตัวผมคิดว่าน่าสนใจนะในทฤษฎีองค์กรซึ่งไม่ได้เป็นผู้ศึกษาด้านรปศ.ด้วยนะรปศ.อาจจะอธิบายได้ดีกว่านะครับอย่างเช่นมันมี element เรื่องleadership เนาะ leadership priority on safety คือถ้ามีภาวะการ นำที่ชัดเจนก็จะช่วยในเรื่อง safety ได้สูงขึ้นนะครับเรื่องของการทำซ้ำๆ redundancy ในบางนัยยะมันไม่ค่อยดีนะฮะแต่ในนัยยะแบบเรื่องของความปลอดภัยเนี่ยมันดีในเชิงที่ว่าถ้าเราเช็คแล้วเช็คอีกนะมี multiple layers คือหลายๆชั้นของการตรวจสอบตรวจทานเนี่ยsystem safety และกระบวนการต่างๆมันก็จะเกิดขึ้นได้มีโอกาสที่จะมีความเสี่ยงน้อยลงว่างั้นเถอะนะครับอันนี้ทำซ้ำๆนะครับแล้วก็มี2ตัวก่อนแล้วก็ decentralization คือการกระจายอำนาจถ้าแปลในคอนเทกต์นี้คือมีลักษณะที่อนุญาตให้มันมีการตรวจสอบเพิ่มเติมไม่ได้รวมศูนย์อยู่ที่เดียวก็อาจจะช่วยได้นะครับแล้วก็ safety culture อันนี้เราอาจจะคุ้นๆอยู่เนาะแบบสร้างวัฒนธรรมให้ตระหนักมากขึ้นตรงนี้ก็จะช่วยได้ทำให้ตัวองค์กรเนี่ยมันมีความ reliable มากขึ้นนะครับอาจารย์จะเล่าเสริมไหม
ค่ะก็เสริมจากอาจารย์ท็อปก็คือจาก3ตัวนี้ที่อาจารย์ท็อปบอกอะค่ะมันเกิดในองค์กรที่เหมือนมีความเสี่ยงสูงองค์กรที่แบบมันจะต้องแบบมีแบบเป็นสภาพแวดล้อมที่เรารู้อยู่แล้วแหละว่ามันน่าจะมีความเสี่ยงเพราะฉะนั้นน่ะการที่ถ้าเกิดว่าเราดำเนินการจัดการสิ่งเหล่านี้ได้อะค่ะมันก็สามารถที่จะควบคุมปัญหาความเสี่ยงต่างๆแล้วก็ความน่าเชื่อถือต่างๆได้อะค่ะแล้วก็ภายใต้3ตัวนี้ค่ะก็จะมี3ตัวก็คืออันที่1ก็คือองค์กรอาจจะต้องดูเรื่องของดีไซน์นะคะการจัดดีไซน์ให้มันเกิดการปฏิบัติการที่ปลอดภัยค่ะอันที่2ก็คือเรื่องของการจัดการนะคะแล้วก็อันที่3เป็นเรื่องของระบบนะคะการทำให้ระบบเนี่ยมันแบบมั่นคงอะไรอย่างเงี้ยค่ะ
คุณครับแล้วก็ทฤษฎีที่4ก็จะเป็นเรื่อง system safety หรือว่าการสร้างระบบของความปลอดภัยอันนี้ในการบรรยายท่านอาจารย์บอกว่ามันจะเป็นในเชิงแบบ engineering perspective หน่อยนะครับเป็นของสายแบบระดับพวกในเชิงวิศวกรรมแล้วนะครับก็พยายามที่จะต้องกำจัดในส่วนของความเสี่ยงต่างๆออกไปให้ได้โดยทำให้มันเป็นเรื่องของระบบให้มากที่สุดให้มันเป็นซิสเต็มให้มากที่สุดนะครับแล้วก็เมื่อจบในส่วนของพาร์ทของทฤษฎีเนี่ยช่วงท้ายอาจารย์ท่านก็ยกภาพที่ดูค่อนข้างน่ากลัวนะครับคือเคส Deep Water นะครับ Horizon ซึ่งมันเกิดขึ้นในปี 2010 นะครับในอ่าวเม็กซิโกเนาะผมหาข้อมูลเพิ่มเติมมันเกิดน้ำมันรั่วไหลที่แท่นขุดเจาะน้ำมันนะครับอันนั้นปัญหาใหญ่ตามมาเยอะมากแล้วก็ต้องใช้เวลาเคลียร์เกือบเป็น3 เดือนนะฮะในการที่จะเคลียร์สิ่งที่มันเป็นของเสียลงไปในทะเลเนี่ยนะครับอันเนี้ยก็เป็นเคสหนึ่งที่ไม่ได้เป็นปัญหาที่จะบอกว่ามันเป็น human error เท่านั้นแต่มันเป็นในระดับ organizational แล้วก็ technical ด้วยหลายๆอย่างที่ทำให้มันเกิดอะไรแบบนี้ขึ้นนะครับแล้วก็สุดท้ายเลยอาจารย์พูดถึงเรื่องความปลอดภัยในโรงพยาบาลไงนะครับเป็นลักษณะที่เป็นตัวอย่างที่ดีที่มันต้องมีมาตรการหลายอย่างมากๆอย่างเช่นถ้าเกิดเป็นวอร์ดที่มีเด็กที่เกิดใหม่เงี้ยเนาะมันต้องมีมาตรการนะเด็กหายไหมหรือว่าเรื่องของการติดเชื้อหรืออะไรต่างๆนะครับก็นั่นก็เป็นตัวอย่างของ organization causes เหมือนกันซึ่งถ้าไม่ควบคุมให้ดีมันจะเกิดdisaster ที่มันไม่อยากให้มีใครเกิดขึ้นได้นะครับอาจารย์อยากได้อะไรอีกไหม
ค่ะก็จริงๆสรุปรวมเนาะนะคะในหมู่ของคณะรัฐศาสตร์เราเนี่ยนะคะมันก็จะมีสาขาหนึ่งเนาะที่พูดถึงรัฐประศาสนศาสตร์หรือว่าบริหารรัฐกิจใช่ไหมคะแล้วเราก็รู้สึกว่าสาขานี้ก็อาจจะไม่ได้เกี่ยวข้องกับปรัชญาสังคมศาสตร์เราเลยอะไรอย่างเงี้ยค่ะแต่ว่าพอมาจากการฟังวันนี้ค่ะก็พบว่าอย่างที่อาจารย์เลสประเด็นต่างๆขึ้นมาว่าปัญหานะคะต่างๆที่เกิดขึ้นปัญหาแบบนิวเคลียร์ปัญหาอะไรอื่นๆแล้วก็รวมถึงปัญหาแบบเหตุการณ์ข่าวใหญ่ๆที่มันเกิดขึ้นเนี่ยมันก็ไม่ได้เกิดขึ้นจากที่อย่างที่อาจารย์ท็อปบอกมันไม่ได้เกิดจากตัวเทคโนโลยีเองแต่ว่ามันต้องย้อนกลับมาดูปัญหาของการจัดองค์กรอะไรอย่างเงี้ยค่ะซึ่งตรงเนี้ยก็คิดว่าน่าจะเป็นประโยชน์ในการเปิดพื้นที่ให้กับรัฐศาสตร์สาขาหนึ่งก็คือรปศเนาะในการที่จะเข้ามาเกี่ยวข้องอินโวลกับปรัชญาสังคมศาสตร์ของพวกเราด้วยค่ะขอบคุณค่ะ
มีขอบคุณครับอาจารย์ชยัน Q&A ใช่ไหมครับโอเคก็เดี๋ยวจะมีคำถามจากอาจารย์ชยันแล้วก็อาจารย์วัชรพลเนาะโอเค So Daniel, Q&A now.
Great,
Alright.
thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask in English? Yes. Thank you for provocative my thought and thank you for the fruitful lecture. I'm just because I'm involved in the disaster management sector, so I just want to ask you some questions about what is intention? What is intention? Why do you relate your philosophy to the disaster? I just clarify because you're talking about too much about the organization dysfunctions, right? And thinking about the system failures or organization failure. So I think our professor want to relate it, the topic of thought. And I think you need to find the way to thinking how the disaster constructs. It is right. This is the first question. The second question, we are on the social society that we believe that not only the organization construct the disaster. We believe that for some reason, society can construct the disaster also. So what do you think about this kind of word? Thank you very much.
Great, those are really excellent questions, and I appreciate them. What connection to the philosophy of social science? I think my answer is that I think philosophers need to be genuinely involved in the practical intellectual life of other disciplines. And so sociology of organizations, for example, is of great interest to me. And I kind of feel that a philosopher can contribute to that discipline, partly because we've all been in organizations. We've seen some of these failures directly, but also just taking the time to think critically about cases like the Deepwater Horizon case, allows a philosopher, not with greater insight than a sociologist, but maybe in the division of labor, more reflectively to try to connect the dots, how failures of interagency communication, interfirm communication, how those kind of intersect with the decisions made by an engineer making an assessment at a particular time in a moment of crisis, go forward or not go forward. A lot of pressure on that decision. In other words, I think a philosopher can bring some light to this question. I also think it's a really interesting case for philosophy of social science generally, because it is science, this effort to kind of put together a science of safety is, I think that's a very attainable goal. It is inherently interdisciplinary. It's not just for sociology, it's not just for organizational science, it's not just for engineering. Engineers tend to think we handle safety, but actually engineers often have a very superficial understanding of the social and organizational side of the work that they do. So being interdisciplinary is very important. The other connection that I am aware of is that in this science, there are very few generalizations. It's really not about generalizations. It's about the discovery of mechanisms, the discovery of specific sequences and propensities which occur in organizations, which then lead to failure, and sometimes those failures are catastrophic. So I do think that there are connections to the philosophy of social science, but I also think it's good for philosophers to, to the extent that we're able to kind of pick up an empirical debate and contribute to it, I think it's a good thing to do. Your second question also is interesting. Are there social causes larger than organizational causes? And I do believe that that's true. A good example is the Tianjin port explosion, 8 years or so ago. A terrible explosion in the port, northeast China, leading to the deaths of about 200 emergency responders. And why did it occur? Well, mostly it occurred because of a culture of political and business corruption. I'm pretty sure people were executed after this, when the investigations came to a close. Businesses and owners and directors and so forth, they were subject to criminal investigation, and some were very severely punished. Sometimes people were executed for corruption. That's not a very effective way of enhancing safety. What seemed to allow businesses to accumulate huge sacks of highly explosive material is the fact that they could give a little bundle of yuan to an inspector who would just look the other way. So the culture of corruption, that's a sociological feature, not really a regulatory. I mean, it's regulatory. It's why the regulatory regime failed, but it's also a social feature. I think you could probably offer me examples of how features of Thai society or Chinese or American society contribute to potential, and I absolutely agree with you that there are those very highest level kind of social, cultural causes as well. That's certainly true. What I personally have found the most interesting, though, are these glitches which we can understand. We can almost offer a political science explanation. Principal-agent problems, for example. The supervisor demands that people always check the log and follow up on anything which happened overnight to make sure that it doesn't have consequences for the next day. That might be a rule, but the supervisor says do it, and the person in the operating room says, all these rules, it's ridiculous. One of the rules is don't spill the water. I'm not going to do that. He's never going to know. That would be a principal-agent problem, very familiar from political science, and it's a very pervasive organizational dysfunction.
I guess that, hello, yeah, I guess that we have collective appreciation of your lecture. I just wonder whether this concept, which I appreciate very much, how is square with a concept which is widely used in history, unintended consequences. I mean, history, look at it in temporal terms. Yeah? How do you square this concept with that concept in history?
Mm-hmm. So that's also a great question to think about. I myself think that most historical outcomes are unintended consequences. Certainly accidents are unintended. And so an executive at Boeing Aircraft Company could very well say, when we redesigned the 737 MAX, we had safety in mind. We were strongly committed to safety. We intended to build a safe system. But regrettably, big crocodile tears, things went wrong. Mistakes were made, and people died. 2 crashes killed 500 people or so. But we didn't intend that. It was an unintended consequence. The critique that I would offer, it's a critique, not just a diagnosis, is those mistakes happened because Boeing made a deliberate, intentional decision to withdraw resources, withdraw money from the engineering staff that was responsible for redesign of these flight systems, and to outsource that activity to the lowest bidder with very little quality control exercised by Boeing, with very little assessment exercised by Boeing. And so I would say the unintended outcome is the crashes of the aircraft, but the predictable outcome was there was a likelihood of failure, which might lead to, in the airline industry, failures often lead to death. So unintended, but was it also unpredictable or unexpected? I don't think they expected these aircraft to crash, but I think they could rationally have calculated, if we've done like Aeroflot. I once flew in an Aeroflot jet, and it said, in the back of the seat pocket, it said, to our passengers are often anxious during takeoff and landing. We would like to inform you, crashes are only likely on landing. It's a pretty bad. It's a pretty. I can't stop laughing at this crazy warning to the Aeroflot passenger. It's a pretty bad way of handling air crashes, is to warn people, your crash is still coming. It's at the end of the flight. But normally, when accidents happen, there is an explanation for what the system failure was. And I think those system failures, they're not intended, but they are kind of predictable. And that's why this science is so important, understanding that there's a relationship between cost cutting in safety management and design leads to the higher probability of accidents, which leads to a certain frequency of catastrophic failures, which lead to death and other kinds of harm. So unintended, yes, of course, that's true, but unanticipated, I think, is maybe not the case. In hospitals, this hospital safety issue is really a very important one. And I've had conversations with experts at my own health system at the University of Michigan who've said, I'm very worried about this too, because our bosses are saying, reduce the amount of time you spend with a patient, reduce the amount of time you spend inputting data, get it right, of course, but don't waste time on it. And the result of that is the possibility of error, putting in 100 milligrams when it should have been 10 milligrams, leading to, illness for the patient. Those are system errors that a good hospital administrator should be absolutely mindful of. He should already know in advance, this could happen, and therefore I'm going to spend more money than other people might think rational to have safety procedures which make it much more difficult to enter a bad prescription. In Thailand, do you use digital medical records, which are portable from one hospital to another and where all patient information is stored? I don't know if you do or not. Perfect. Yes, I've heard that. Okay.
No, it's okay. No, I just have the earlier slide of your presentation, the one on prominent accidents, and then you include sexual misconduct in the list of prominent accidents. I just wonder how come the misconduct be an accident?
Good. It's a good question. I guess not very much turns on whether it's an accident or an undesirable outcome. But in the past 10 years in the U.S., there have been some very major sexual abuse and sexual harassment scandals which seem to go beyond one individual, one bad doctor. And they have also to do with failure to recognize or acknowledge reports of misconduct, an effort of administration to silence people who are complaining. In other words, these are system failures. Let's not call it an accident. Let's call it a really terrible outcome. How did that terrible outcome happen? And there are two possibilities. One is you had a rogue doctor who was a predator, and somehow he got into a position where he could mistreat female patients. That's one actor created the harm. But a more system-oriented approach would say, yes, but what about oversight? What about the sexual harassment office? What about the responsibility of the president of the university and the dean responsible? And we have many cases in the United States where deans and provosts and others have not done the right thing. They have not removed a person for careful investigation. They have sometimes intimidated people who are bringing complaints forward. They've silenced complaints. Those are exactly the wrong steps to take in terms of trying to change the culture of sexual harassment. And so you're right, it's not exactly an accident. It's a bad outcome for a university or a library or a research laboratory. These are all places where sexual harassment takes place, and the goal would be to reduce it to zero. And yet, after lots and lots of money has been spent in universities to reduce and eliminate sexual harassment, the scandals continue to happen. And therefore, we need diagnosis. We need to understand why these system failures occur. There were criminal charges eventually dismissed against the president of Michigan State University, which is one of the great universities in the United States, on the ground that she had deliberately failed to acknowledge complaints about this particular doctor who's now in prison for the rest of his life. But the damage is done. Several hundred female patients were sexually mistreated by him. And the claim was made, and then criminal charges were brought, that she was informed of these complaints, and she, I don't know what the correct term is, she put them in the drawer and didn't pay attention to them. It turns out it wasn't completely true, but the point is that kind of neglect of bad news it happens in organizations, and we need to have organizational solutions for that kind of problem.
I have a rather broad question. Can this idea, the system failure, be applicable to a very big one system like society? If so, I don't know what would it be to apply to a kind of a very complex system like society. Because my idea is that do we need to separate the big system into a subsystem and then use your idea like the system failure one by one or something like that?
It's a really intriguing question. So I've tried to translate it in my head as you were speaking into the growth of inequality in the United States in the past 25 years, extreme inequality, extreme, maybe moderate by Thai standards, but the inequality between rich and poor in the United States is broader than it has been in 50 years. You could call that a system failure. It's really a democratic failure. I'm not sure that these tools help with that, because it's more like, you know, is inequality inevitable in a capitalist system? Well, some inequality is. Are there mechanisms which could lead to less inequality? There are mechanisms, but the United States is not trying them. There's not a political consensus in favor of more redistribution. For example, there's a proposal by Senator Elizabeth Warren to have a wealth tax, a 1% wealth tax on people like Elon Musk. And there was a look of disapproval. I don't care for that gentleman. A wealth tax could redistribute trillions of dollars. And there's just no political support for creating a wealth tax. It's considered to be socialism, communism. It's considered all these negative words. That seems like a democratic failure, but not necessarily a system, and not necessarily the kind of organizational failure that we could correct by better supervision or better training. So I'm not sure that this set of topics does port very well up to the biggest kinds of problems. Can we end racism by paying attention to these kinds of mechanisms? No, I think we need to do different things, more political things, more educational things, to address problems of systemic racism. I don't know.
Okay. We're talking about today about disasters, and I mean coronavirus is one of disaster. My question is, it costs over 7 million people life, and is there this case go on until you know the reason and how? First, I mean, I have 3 questions about that. The reasons of how it happened, and how to prevent, and how we can treat this this, I mean, this case,
Great.
which it shouldn't have happened again.
Great.
Nothing to talk about long COVID. A lot of people suffer about long COVID.
Right. Right.
Thank you.
So how much of the COVID disaster was human caused or organizationally or institutionally caused? The virus itself, to me, my interpretation is it's just a natural occurrence. So diseases emerge periodically, like the influenza pandemic of 1917. Viruses emerge and kill a lot of people. That's true. What really failed was, in many countries, including the United States, was public health policies which were intelligently designed, but then frustrated by right-wing opposition. Public health policies which were well established in other pandemics about isolation, social isolation, requiring masks in public, requiring vaccination in critical industries like nurses and doctors. These requirements were exactly what was needed in order to suppress the rate of infection and eventually extinguish the disease. But in many states in the United States, it became impossible to continue to enforce those very sensible public health requirements. But again, I would call that a political crisis, not exactly an organizational crisis. In my own state, there was a conspiracy by right-wing armed subnormal lunatics to kidnap and kill the governor of our state because she supported public health requirements involving masks and isolation. They wanted to kill her. This is insane response to a perfectly legitimate exercise of state power. I'm very proud of my state in terms of its leadership during the COVID pandemic. Female governor, female attorney general, and it was women who really steered us through that, that crisis in my state. But the ways in which public health policies failed in my state had to do with right-wing opposition. Don't interfere with my freedom. Don't require me to wear a mask. Don't require me to not go to work if I'm sick. That resistance became so powerful that the state policies had to just kind of back off, and they loosened their requirements, which I think slowed the progress that was being made to slow down the pandemic in our state. I think fighting a disease, well, okay, here's one other failure that may be on the horizon. What's the next pandemic? Are we making proper centralized scientific plans for identifying and then responding quickly to the next virus or fungus which has the chance of becoming pandemic, global pandemic in scope? I have read that U.S. preparation is now lower than it should be. Well, that would be an organizational failure. The Center for Disease Control or whatever the appropriate health agency within the federal government really should be on high alert to bird flu, I think is one emerging disease which there's pandemic fear about. And if we fail to do the scientific planning and public health planning necessary to control an emerging disease, then shame on us. Long COVID is less of an organizational problem, I think. It's more of a medical problem. So maybe not so much errors were made as we don't really have enough scientific understanding of what the causes of long COVID are. Apparently it's improving. We have a better understanding today than we did 6 months ago, but it's still a little bit mysterious.
I mean, the failure or to the health organization, you can't just prepare all this huge problem. Let it for the organization, I mean health organization, which is you prepare all that, all the thing, and how many hospitals have to be, how many beds have to be in hospital.
Yeah.
It just prepare for this disaster. Should have been. If it should have been prepare wouldn't, how do you put it, be many people die like this. But you can't just prepare for that.
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. When COVID first emerged, the scientific understanding of the disease itself was really not very advanced, and what the curve was likely to be, what the curve of infection was likely to be, which then determines what hospital bed utilization is likely to look like. That's the kind of thing that epidemiologists try to project. And I think the health systems in the US did a pretty good job of doing those projections, making estimates about capacity. One of the goals of vaccination was it didn't necessarily mean fewer people infected, but a longer time period so that hospital systems could handle them. So that kind of planning, kind of logistical planning, scientific planning, I think it really is critical. And planning for the next pandemic, likewise, requires scientific preparation, except you don't really know what the disease will be. Yeah. So we have 5 hours to discuss it. So we're traveling back to Chiang Mai together shortly.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for your talk, and it's very interesting. And since we've talked about COVID and like other kind of failures in like companies and like events, I think the next natural thing to ask is that what about other big crises or like big failures like climate change or like financial crisis? What do you think about it? Do you think it can be viewed in the same light? Do you think we can intervene, or like what do you think about those?
So number one, I think this body of material is not a kind of a general purpose solution to all social problems. I think it's intended to be a diagnosis of one way in which our organizations fail us, and I think that's useful all by itself. But global climate change is a much bigger problem. There are organizational failures, I'm sure, involved in global climate change, maybe especially in terms of international cooperation institutions. We probably have a reasonably good understanding of why China, the United States, and, I don't know, Poland maybe don't agree about what levels of CO2 emission should be prescribed in the next treaty. We disagree about stuff like that, but we also don't have enforcement mechanisms, so treaties are difficult to enforce. So there are reasons why, unfortunately bad reasons, dysfunctional reasons, and maybe catastrophically awful reasons why responses to global climate change have been so weak, so ineffective. The United States, I think, is a terrible example because of the opposition, the climate denial that has occurred in the United States going back 20 years. Climate scientists have been discredited by the right, by Republican and conservative political leaders. Oh, that's bullshit. That just doesn't make any sense at all. There's no scientific basis. That's just refusing to admit the scientific evidence. But it has persuaded a lot of people in the United States the cost of remediating climate change is too great, and we should just go back to fossil fuels and hope for the best. That's a crazy line of thought, but it seems to be a prominent one in the United States and maybe in other European countries as well. This analysis, I don't think, helps us very much there. I think there are good political science theories and public opinion theories and so forth that would be more helpful. I bet it's time to move on to your next couple of panels. So thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
ก็ในช่วงเช้านะครับก็เสร็จสิ้นลงไปแล้วนะครับในการบรรยายนะครับเรียกว่า special lecture นะครับในหัวข้อ organizational causes of large technology failures นะครับซึ่ง ladies and gentlemen, let's take a moment to express our heartfelt gratitude for Professor Daniel Little for his enlightening and thought-provoking lecture in this morning. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. ครับในลำดับต่อไปนะฮะก็เข้าสู่ช่วงสำคัญนะครับเมื่อวานนะครับเราก็ลุยกันไปตั้ง หัวข้อนะครับในแต่ละพาเนลนะครับแล้วก็ในวันนี้ครับเราจะมีอีก3หัวข้อด้วยกันนะครับในการนำเสนอบทความทางด้านปรัชญาทางสังคมศาสตร์นะครับเป็นเซสชันที่3นะครับต่อจาก2เซสชันก่อนหน้านี้ของเมื่อวานนะครับโดยในวันนี้นะครับหัวข้อแรกนะครับจะขอเรียนเชิญคุณกันนาเมืองรักครับได้นำเสนอนะครับในบทความหัวข้อจินตภาพของความรู้และปัญหาของการตีความในวิทยาการสมัยใหม่ความเป็นการเมืองระหว่างชาติพันธุ์นิพนธ์และปรากฏการณ์วิทยาครับขอเรียนเชิญครับ
อ๋อโอเคครับสวัสดีครับมันต้องยังไงมันเปิดจากตรงไหนครับใช่ครับอ๋อเดี๋ยวเปิดให้ครับตอนแรก